Wayne in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hey, Wayne, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. I have a question regarding the protests around the country that's happening now.
Yeah.
And in order to keep the energy up, I was wondering, what do you think about the wisdom or effectiveness if they have a temporary suspension of those and coalesce and combine in San Diego, which is where the Trump lawsuit is taking place on November 28th, to have like a mega protest to keep that in the news, keep the pressure on Trump. And I'm sure if there's nothing going on there, that the news.
Which lawsuit is happening in San Diego?
The Trump University lawsuit.
I thought that was in Arizona or New Mexico. Judge Curiel?
I looked up on the web. It's in San Diego and district court there.
Ah, okay.
And that it's supposed to be the 28th.
Right.
About 10 days. And if the protests take the next step, that they have a mass protest there with the regional ones, plus new protesters, and to give it some exposure to the world, and that media like Fox and the corporate news probably won't give it short shrift if nothing's going on there to try to kowtow to Trump. But if there's a giant protest along with the lawsuits taking place, that might be some strategy they can take advantage of. Yeah,
I agree. That'll be interesting. What's going to be really interesting to watch, and Wayne, thank you for the call. What's going to be really interesting to watch over the next 6 months in particular is whether the media works to legitimize Donald Trump or whether the media works to expose Donald Trump, because they could go either way. If you go back to the election of 2000, I talked about this either early this week or late last week. Back in the election of 2000, George W. Bush did not win that election. I mean, this is fairly common knowledge now. Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris threw somewhere between 40 and 80,000 African-American men, mostly, off the voting rolls in Florida because they had the same first and last names. Many of them had very different middle names, completely different dates of birth and Social Security numbers, but they had the first name and last name as felons in Texas. And, and many of them were common black names, African-American names. So so number one, George Bush did not win that election legitimately. And when the votes were actually counted a year later, I'll get to that in just a second. So, there was this sense among the American people that the Bush presidency was an illegitimate presidency, that George W. Bush wasn't actually the guy who was elected our president. Al Gore got 500,000 votes. Hillary Clinton just, it looks like she's going to end up with 2 million more votes than Donald Trump. He won the Electoral College, but he didn't win the popular vote. Hillary Clinton did. So anyhow, back to 2000, there was this broad sense among the American people that this guy stole it. His brother stole it for him in Florida, and then the Supreme Court finished the job. And when the motorcade, and I would love it if some of the people who have some of the old footage would start putting it up on YouTube and reminding us about this. I'm not suggesting this is what should happen again. I'm not calling for this. I'm just pointing this out. When the motorcade went down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol building to the White House to install George Bush in his home. Now, you'll remember when Jimmy Carter, those of you old enough to remember, the election of what would it have been, 1978? No, 76, yeah, the election of 1976. Jimmy Carter walked from the Capitol building where he was sworn in to the White House. He walked. And people all along the way were cheering him. Oh, my God, thank you. After all these years of Richard Nixon and the corruption and Jerry Ford pardoning him and those lousy Republicans, it was a love fest. 4 years later, 24 years later, George W. Bush is hiding in his limousine, and people are throwing eggs at it and screaming obscenities at him all the way along the path. And the media edited their video the stuff that they showed on television, to not show those things because there was this belief in the newsrooms in America that that it would be un-American to contribute to the perception of the people of the United States that the American president was not legitimate. That it would be un-American to question the legitimacy of the president. And then similarly, after 9/11, the month after 9/11, or actually it was 2 months, it was November of 2002, 1 year and 2 months after 9/11. I said a month after, a year and a month, a year and 2 months after 9/11. All those ballots down in Florida, they'd all been shipped up to New York, and they were hand counted by a consortium that included the New York Times, the USA Today, I think of the Washington Post, I think AP. There was 4 or 5 news agencies. And what they found, and the New York Times published this, it was buried in the 17th paragraph of the story, and the headline didn't say this, but what they found was that by any measure, hanging Chad, pimple Chad, dimple Chad, intent of the voter, overvote, undervote, by any measure, Al Gore won Florida in 2000. But they didn't put that in the headline because 9/11 had happened the year before. No, actually, this was 2 months after 9/11. I'm sorry. 9/11 happened a year after the election. So this was November of 2001. This was 2 months after 9/11. They didn't put it in the headline because they didn't, and I think it was Schultzberger was the publisher of the New York Times at the time. He was on the record as saying, we basically buried this story. My words, not his, but we basically buried the story in the 17th paragraph because we didn't want people to question the legitimacy of our president during a time of national crisis. Just 6-8 weeks after 9/11. So they failed to tell the American people that George Bush was not even elected president. So here's the question. If Donald Trump faces similar protests, will they get covered? It's going to be a real interesting few months here.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.